Page 110. I supposed my life was over. On Monday at school, I couldn't even look Royce McNabb's way. I supposed all his worst fears about me had been realized, and then some. Now he thought I lived in a madhouse with a trigger-happy grandma and snakes and naked, nude women in the attic. But everybody was in such an uproar, I was lost in the shuffle. People who hadn't ever seen her could describe every square inch of Maxine Patch, speeding like Eve headlong through town on a Sunday afternoon. Augie Fluke said she did the high jump over tree stumps. Ina Ray didn't know what to think, but knew better than to quiz me about it. Then when we got up for the Pledge of Allegiance, Royce looked back and somehow caught my eye, and he winked. That could have meant anything, of course, but I tried my shy smile again and hoped for the best. Before the week was out, it began to dawn on me that nobody would hold a little excitement against you in a town as quiet as this one. And just as they'd begun to take him for granted, Arnold Green sparked new interest. There was some talk about running him out of town. Various church groups called meetings. Shamed though she was, Maxine had to go back to work at the post office. From the stamp counter, she sent forth word that Arnold Green had deceived her. Her reputation was in ruins, and he'd have to marry her. I suppose word of this must have reached Grandma. One night out of the blue, she said to me, "You better have your lady teacher here to supper one night." I jumped. "Miss Butler here?" Grandma nodded. "She'll be passing out grades pretty soon, and you want to keep on the good side of her." I was already on the good side of her. I got the only A she gave in English. Grandma didn't tell me to invite Mr. Herkimer, though. She well knew how I was doing in math. "Grandma, do I have to?" Miss Butler looked startled when I invited her for supper. She was too polite to say no, but she gave me a long look, curious and dubious. When the evening came, I sat waiting for her in our front room. Grandma had cooked all day, and I was a bundle of nerves. At the sound of a timid knock, I opened the front door to Miss Butler. She was in her dotted Swiss, which is a kind of material of her dress. "Well, Mary Alice," she said, "how nice." Seeing my teacher in our front room was eerie. It was a new experience for Miss Butler, too. When I showed her to a chair, her eyes roamed the room. She read Grandma's souvenir of Starved Rock pillow. She noticed the flat square in the carpet where we'd taken down the stove after winter. Since most of what she'd heard about us Dowdells didn't make for polite conversation, ours drifted. Grandma loomed suddenly in the door to the kitchen in a fresh apron. "Come on in," she boomed at Miss Butler, "and we'll tie the feed bag on you." Miss Butler quaked. So did I when I saw the kitchen table. It was set with 4 plates. Before I could think, Arnold Green stepped up behind us. His horn rims flashed and my brain buzzed. Miss Butler was so refined, even prim, and there was talk of running Arnold Green out of town for ruining Maxine Patch. And Grandma had invited him to supper. Oh, Grandma, I thought, what are you up to? I fumbled over the introductions. "I have heard so much about, how do you do?" Miss Butler murmured to Mr. Green. I knew I couldn't eat a bite, but Grandma bustled around the chairs, loading the table. Fried chicken, mashed turnips, hominy with stewed tomatoes, and a casserole of canned green beans and fatback. Since nothing was ready in the garden, there was a quivering green jello mold. There were corn muffins and cloverleaf rolls, 2 kinds of jelly in cut glass dishes, a decorative butter pat from the Cowgills Dairy Farm. You couldn't even see the oilcloth. "Oh my," murmured Miss Butler, "how much?" But Arnold Green fell to it. They didn't feed him well at the Coffee Pot Cafe, and he was a starving artist. Grandma presided from her end of the table, gazing at a gizzard and demolishing a thigh. She piled bones, waiting for the silence to force conversation. At last, Miss Butler chanced a glance across the groaning table at Arnold Green. I was too young to know how much a dangerous man interests a good woman. His glasses were steamed from the dinner, so it was hard to catch his eye. But she spoke. "I so admire the artistic temperament." In silence, Grandma loaded a fork with mashed turnips. Miss Butler had a low, pleasing voice when she wasn't yelling at us in school. My only talent is appreciation, she said. I sit at the feet of the bard. Arnold Green flickered. Indeed, I look up to all men of artistic talent, Miss Butler said, though she was no shorter than Arnold Green. He looked suddenly across Cruets at her, and their eyes met. Somehow Grandma knew. In a town like this, an unmarried man was either going to be packed off or picked off. She decided against Maxine Patch, so she backed Miss Butler. For the rest of the month, until he went back to New York, most evenings found Arnold Green strolling to Noah Atterbury's. Miss Butler roomed there. They sat on the porch swing in full view. At the time, I suppose they discussed art and poetry and Paris. He used Vitalis now, and Kreml for his dandruff. Grandma kept him in clean shirts. Public opinion shifted his way. Maxine Patch was fit to be tied. And I didn't mind too much about Royce. He was friendly enough, but either he was keeping his distance or I was keeping mine. We'd both been strangers in the midst here, but what was that enough? I guess not, and I didn't mind too much. Really, not at all, hardly. Page 115, Gone with the Wind. Suddenly school was almost out and summer upon us, and I didn't know what to think about that. We had a stretch of perfect weather here in the healthiest climate in Illinois. Little red blushes showed down in Grandma's strawberry plants. The hollyhocks were every color. Trees leafed out overnight, and the streets were like tunnels with bright countryside at either end. One magic morning, the whole town was scented with lilac. Spring didn't come to Chicago like this. I went around with a lump in my throat. I couldn't account for it. Then a letter came from Mother with a postscript from Dad. We'd written back and forth all year, though of course I didn't tell him everything. Mother always tucked in a stamp for me to use to write back. Joey sent postcards, a burro in a sombrero of the Fort Peck Dam. One was of the Great Salt Lake with a little bag of real salt sewn to the card. I still have them. And then this letter came from Mother and Dad. I'd made my way to school every morning, lost in thought. By now I knew who lived in every house along the way. I knew this town as I'd never known Chicago. Graduation was coming, though we were only graduating 5. 4 girls who never spoke to anybody younger, just like in Chicago, and Royce McNabb. They'd chosen their class motto, "We finish only to begin." Now plans were afoot from all school party to wind up the year. We divided into committees, though Carlene Lovejoy didn't want me on hers. I was one of them now, but I hadn't been born here. Then, in the midst of an ideal day, the sky outside our classroom windows turned a shade of yellow that I've never seen. We were in home ec, and the room stirred. This is one of those times when everybody else knew something that I didn't. The siren on the town water tower suddenly wailed. Mr. Fluke leaned in the door. "Miss Butler, get your girls to the basement, quick as you can." She laid a hand on her throat. She was wearing an engagement ring now, about 1/8 of a carat. Something akin to the end of the world seemed to be happening. It was like evening in here. People were just shapes, and I turned to Ina Ray. "That's a tornado siren," she said, bug-eyed, and already out of her desk. She often looked worried, and now she looked scared. I was petrified. I'd heard about tornadoes, but thought they happened somewhere else. Everybody filed out so orderly, I didn't know them. And then we were on the stairs to the basement. Then I'd shied off and was running across the schoolyard, skirt tails whipping, Cuban heels pounding. Anybody with good sense was taking cover, but I wanted to go home. A breeze came up. The coffee pot cafe looked empty, and the screen door was beginning to flap. Hanging pots swayed on people's porches, and it kept getting darker. When I was in sight of home, rain bucketed from every direction, and there was Grandma making her way to the house up the back walk, leaning into the wind. She held something against herself, folded in her apron. She looked astounded to see me and pointed to the house. The clothesline was twanging and the wet wind was full of chaff from the fields. We made it to the kitchen, plastered with wet leaves. She sent me down the cellar stairs ahead of her. Go to that southwest corner. But I didn't know where it was. Everybody but me knew you always shelter in the southwest corner of a cellar. Tornadoes come from that direction, usually. With any luck, the house will be blown off of you, not on you. She got around me and led the way. I'd never known more about the cellar than I could help. If we had a snake in the attic, who knew what lived down here? It had an earth floor and it was stacked with jars. I thought of flying glass. A splintery old deacon's bench was wedged across the southwest corner. Grandma dropped down, breathing hard. I needed to know if we were going to die. In the gloom, her gleaming spectacles turned on me. What in the Sam Hill did that school send you kids home for? She said over the whining wind. They ought to have you under the tables in the school basement. I escaped. I wanted to come home. She could read minds even in the dark. She knew I'd wanted to make sure she was all right. I've lived through all of them so far, she said. But now she was having trouble keeping the bundle in her apron quiet. I felt a paw on my knee as Bootsy stepped from Grandma's lap to mine. Grandma gave up and uncovered April's little green eyes up at us. Grandma, you saved them. She shrugged that off. I happened to be down in the Cobb house when the siren went. Now that was a whopper, and we both knew it. Bootsy was butting my hand, digging in her claws to find a safe place. We began to hear more than wind lashing the trees. The air was full of things now, anything loose. Grandma, are we going to? A terrible sound wiped my mind clean. It was like a giant chattering typewriter directly overhead. That'll be the tacks coming out of the tar paper on the roof, Grandma hollered in my ear. Ooh, boy! Then a Wabash locomotive came full steam at us out of the sky. Here we go, she said. She pushed my head down and we bent double over the cats. Bootsy froze. Then sudden silence popped my ears. Not a jam jar jiggled. Years later, seemingly, the siren sounded all clear. Ordinary gray afternoon fell through the kitchen windows when we got upstairs. Grandma's gardening hat still hung from a chair back. She jammed it on her head and I followed her out onto the back porch. A wide strip of tar paper curled down off the eaves. Grandma looked past it to survey the yard. It looked like a light snow had fallen, but it was the shredded blossoms of the snowball bushes. Limbs were everywhere. Grandma told me to take the cats down to the Cobb house. The shed, she said, and bring back gum boots, gloves, and a crowbar, and step right along. Then we were walking through town. I cleared our way through the fallen branches, so I was glad for the gloves. Chimney bricks were everywhere, and lengths of drain pipe and barrel staves. A voice or two sounded far off from people venturing out. We turned down the street and came to Old Man Nyquist's big corner lot. The barn stood, but there wasn't a leaf on his pecan tree. The front porch and the dog underneath it were missing from his house, and you could see through the roof. Stepping over the lumber, we went back around to get in his kitchen that way. It had been a wreck before the storm. Crusty pans in the sink, a sticky, never-scrubbed floor. Grandma examined it to see if it would take her weight. He naps, she said, starting up the stairs. Behind the first door was nothing but stack after stack of yellowed newspapers. Beyond the second door, half the ceiling had come down and collapsed on an iron bedstead. And under the bedstead was Old Man Nyquist, pinned. Haunted eyes bored out of a gaunt gray face. It looked like we weren't a minute too soon. The crowbar came in handy as we worked like troopers, shifting the bedstead off him. A ton of plaster had fallen on it. We were standing in piles more. At last, Old Man Nyquist rolled free and glared up from the floor. We were all white with plaster dust. You old busybody buzzard, he growled at Grandma. How'd you get in? Your kitchen door's in the yard, you ossified old owl hoot, Grandma yelled, returning fire. I came to rob you blind. He noticed the crowbar. You would, too. He wasn't stone deaf, though he hadn't heard the siren. Staggering to his feet, he swayed like an ancient punch-drunk prizefighter. I thanked heaven that he napped in his clothes. Crunching out over the window, he looked out. He squinted hard and turned in triumph. You'll be hurting for pecans this fall, he bellowed at Grandma. Then I'll get something else you got, she blasted back. So keep it nailed down and locked up, you old skinflint. Biddy, he barked. Coot, she replied. And then we left. I couldn't wait to get out of there. A block away, I said, Grandma, old man Nyquist's mean. She nodded. Nobody'll go near him. He'd have been wedged under them bed springs till the next Republican administration. Nobody'd go near him but Grandma. We walked on toward the Wabash tracks, keeping an eye out for downed wires. Now I knew where we were heading next. We crossed the tracks and turned past the grain elevator and Veach's garage. Beyond the Deere implement shed, we saw Miss Effie Wilcox's house still standing, though her front gate hung by a hinge. But then, maybe it always had. I didn't get over on that side of the tracks very often. Bent siding from the implement shed littered her yard, but her porch was still on. Grandma tried not to hurry. You could see most of the house from the front door, but she made free to go inside. Mrs. Wilcox decorated her living room walls with magazine pictures of puppies and people from the Bible. They were all in place. The crocheted antimacassars in variegated colors lay flat on her armchairs. Mumbling with nerves, Grandma twitched through the room. Mrs. Wilcox's bed was made. Grandma looked under it. In the kitchen was an uncorked Lydia Pinkham's bottle, stood untoppled on the drain board. But the house was deserted. Grandma, are we going to have a look in the cellar? She don't have one. Grandma's brow was furrowed. She glanced out the back door. I couldn't see anything out there, but that was the point. At the end of her garden was a hole in the ground, surrounded by headless jonquils. Grandma nearly fell back. Her privy's gone. What if she blew away in it? What if she fell in the hole? But I fought the thought. Just the idea of Mrs. Wilcox sailing over the grain elevator in her privy was enough. The front door squawked behind us. Mrs. Wilcox drifted through her house and appeared in the kitchen, her usual self. She went all over town in an apron and a hat and carpet slippers. 3 in her kitchen was a crowd. Howdy, she said, focusing on us. Grandma turned on her. Effie, where have you been? Mrs. Wilcox drew in her cheeks, a sight in itself. Well, I don't like to say. Grandma's eyes snapped. I thought you were blown away in your privy. I come close, Mrs. Wilcox said. When that siren blew, I got behind my pie safe, and I was too nervous to live. Couldn't hardly wait for the all clear. Then I really had to go, but my privy had already went. Grandma rubbed her forehead. So you wandered off to use somebody else's privy? Yours, Mrs. Wilcox said. We left then, Grandma bustling to prove that she hadn't given 2 hoots about Mrs. Wilcox. But I saw through it. I hadn't lived with her all year for nothing. Sometimes I thought I was turning into her. I had to watch out not to talk like her, and I was to cook like her for years to come. Picking our way through debris, we crossed the tracks at the Wabash Depot. The town swarmed with people assessing the damage. Weirdly, the sun came out. We got off easy, Grandma remarked. Were tornadoes worse when you were a girl? I asked to test her. She waved me away. What we had today was a light breeze. When I was a girl, a tornado hit an outdoor band concert. It twisted the tuba player 4 feet into the ground like a corkscrew before he could get help to him. We strolled on in our gumboots, Grandma swinging the crowbar. Grandma, is Mrs. Wilcox your best friend? We're neighbors, she said. After Grandma and I got home, we cleaned up the yard, working together till dark.